In Module 19, we combine aggregate demand and both aggregate supply curves. So the axes are what you already know quite well. We have aggregate price level and real GDP. Then we combine long-run aggregate supply, short-run aggregate supply, and aggregate demand. YP, here at the bottom, always goes with long run because remember YP stands for the potential output, and that is synced up with our long run supply curve. Now, if all three lines perfectly intersect, then your equilibrium will be at all three, and then where we have equilibrium, meaning output, is YE, and then the equilibrium price is PE. So those are some of the new subpoints. We're going to practice what will happen when one of these lines shifts and all three are not currently intersecting. So where would equilibrium be? And where do all these subpoints go if they're not all intersecting on the long run curve? All models in macroeconomics like to be at equilibrium. If there's a shortage or a surplus or something is off, the model is going to move itself back to equilibrium. That's its natural resting place. So the question is, where is equilibrium? We know it's where supply and demand intersect, but which supply line, short run or long run? Well, the answer is that we're always on the short run. So the intersection of SRAS and aggregate demand is going to give us our equilibrium point. In the picture below, it says ESR for short run macroeconomic equilibrium. ESR, equilibrium at short run. And what that tells you is that our long run line isn't there. So maybe it's to the left, maybe it's to the right. But the point is, if your long run aggregate supply curve is not perfectly intersecting, then your equilibrium will be a short run equilibrium because it's not on the long run line. When you are labeling the models, you only have to label it E, but sometimes there will be a question that just asks, is the current equilibrium a short run equilibrium point or is it a long run equilibrium? Regardless of where equilibrium is, where it intersects with the price axes will be PE, equilibrium level of the aggregate price level. And then YE, Y here we have is aggregate output or real GDP, and this is the equilibrium level of output. Also, we want to remember that the word equilibrium implies market clearing. What that means is that all goods demanded at that price level will be supplied at that price level, that the quantity of short-run aggregate supply and the quantity of aggregate demand will equal each other at the equilibrium price. Any economic model can have surpluses and shortages. Those occur whenever you're at a price level that is not at the equilibrium price. So in this case, you can see the green line is a price level that is above the equilibrium price. And if you trace that green line across, you can see that where it intersects with SRAS, the overall supply in the economy, is greater than the overall demand in the economy. And when supply is greater than demand, we know that we have a surplus. So you can read surplus and shortages the same way with any of these models. Now, if we have a surplus, that means that the quantity demanded, the quantity of aggregate demand here, so that's demanded by households, firms, and government, is below the level that firms want to produce, the quantity of SRAS. So what that means is that if they're actually supplying this quantity, they have done unplanned inventory investment. Because when firms are producing goods, they expect to sell all of them. They hope to be at that market clearing level so that everything they produce gets sold. But if there's a surplus, they have produced too much and they've spent money to produce those goods. So that was unplanned inventory investment, because remember, inventory investment is spending money on final products and inputs. And that unplanned inventory investment is when you do not end up selling all of those products. So you have inventories, you have stocks that you've created that are just sitting on the shelves unsold. And that's going to create an overall surplus in our economy. Anytime you have a surplus, you have too many goods. And we learned with regular supply and demand that if there are too many goods, that firms will lower the price. That is the solution to every single surplus situation. Now, if the aggregate price level falls in the economy, is that going to be a shifter or a non-shifter on this model? A change in overall prices, APL, is the non-shifter, and that's why the quantity of both lines are changed. So you can see we were here at this PL star. This is showing us the price level in the surplus, but we know that when there is a surplus, the prices are going to fall. So the quantity businesses will produce will decrease since their profits are down. So when they have to lower prices, that's going to affect SRAS. We're talking about what businesses are doing. And so SRAS is moving along the curve towards prices falling. If prices fall, the quantity of aggregate demand will increase. Do we see how the quantity of 80 went to the right? So the quantity supplied decreases, goes to the left. The quantity demanded increases, goes to the right. And they meet at the middle at the equilibrium point. So we can tell that in a surplus, prices will fall. When prices fall, that's a move along the curve for both lines and brings us back to equilibrium. In this next model, we can see that the purple line, the price level that we're seeing, is below the equilibrium price level, which means prices are low. When prices are low, consumers, households, firms, the government, anyone who's buying goods is very happy. So aggregate demand will be high at a low price, but businesses do not want to supply things at that low price. So the short run aggregate supply curve will be very low. So we have a shortage because demand is larger than supply, but also that means we have unintentionally low inventories because the amount that's actually produced is this gold amount here. Supply is what's actually made in the economy. So instead of the quantity supplied being around here at our equilibrium point, it's much lower. So we have a big gap between how much we want to be supplied and how much is actually supplied. Anytime we have a shortage, that means prices are too low. So what we have here is our current shortage line. And the natural effect, if prices are too low, is they're going to increase. That will solve the problem. And because we're talking on the aggregate scale, if prices are going up, the aggregate price level is going up. And that's going to cause a move along the curve for SRAS and AD. If prices go up, that increases profits for businesses. Profits for businesses will be shown on this SRAS curve. So we have a move along the curve for prices rising. And remember, when we're calculating profit, it is the sales price minus the production costs. Sales price went up when the price rose. Wages and production costs will eventually rise, but remember, things like wages are sticky. They are slow to change. So in the short run, if prices go up, that means that your profit is going up and you should produce more. If prices go up, that also affects aggregate demand. So we're starting at the point of the shortage, And when prices go up, we're going to have a move along the curve to the left because the quantity of aggregate demand decreases when prices rise. And the quantity of short-run aggregate supply goes to the right. It increases as prices rise. These will both lead us to equilibrium, and now we are back at that market clearing price. We've been drawing shortages and surpluses and really kind of forgetting about the long run aggregate supply curve. But I have mentioned a few times in class and also in these video series that if anytime you're not perfectly lined up, so very briefly, let's say we're like that. And you can see that all three lines are not perfectly lined up. So we know where aggregate demand is, but the question is it going to intersect with the short run supply or the long run supply? We are always on the short run. And that tells you where equilibrium goes. Because if we were on the long run, our equilibrium point would be here. And that's why this matters to us. So if all three lines intersect perfectly, not a problem. But if they don't, equilibrium is where SRAS, the short run aggregate supply, intersects with aggregate demand. The economy is naturally going to be moving back to the long run curve, moving back to potential. So in the long run, we will return to the long run. But until then, we are always currently operating on the short run aggregate supply curve. Now we're going to talk about what happens to the overall model when one of the lines shifts, because we've individually shifted supply and we've shifted demand, but we haven't really put them all together. So if AD shifts, that's called a demand shock. Aggregate demand is economy-wide. So if there's a big change in the overall demand, that's called a demand shock. You can see the picture on the left is a negative demand shock because the aggregate demand curve shifted left or inward. To the right, you have a positive demand shock because the aggregate demand curve shifted right or outward. So all demand shock means is that AD shifted. Now, if long run was here, it wouldn't really mess anything up. We could have our long run supply. You would just need to label it LRAS. And wherever long run goes, YP goes to that potential output is the necessary part. So I just want you to see that with or without that long run supply curve doesn't actually matter. Demand shock is just telling us that the aggregate demand curve shifted. Now, little review. What are the AD shifters? Remember our acronym is GRUIT. So G, think about it. G is for GDP. Remember, if C, consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, or net exports increase, the whole line shifts right. R in GRUIT is for resource size. That's about the size of the existing physical capital. So if your resource size is low, you need to spend money to fix the problem, and AD would shift right. E in GRUIT is for expectations/confidence. Remember, this is economy-wide. What's happening to our economy? Do you think that the next few years are going to be good? Then consumer and business confidence would be high. We expect growth in the future, and AD would shift right. W stands for wealth/income. So if the value of your assets and wealth goes up, you can buy more, and AD would shift right. If your real income rose, that means that your income is rising faster than inflation rate, which would be a wonderful thing, and you would have the ability to spend more money. AD would shift right. I in GRUIT is interest rates, and this is about monetary policy. The Federal Reserve printing money, which affects interest rates, and consumer and investment spending both respond to interest rates, which shifts AD. And then finally, the T stands for taxes and transfers, which is part of fiscal policy. Fiscal is actually three things. It's taxes, transfers, and government spending. But for shifters, we talked about only taxes and transfers because government spending is already part of GDP. It's the G in that SIG XM equation. So hopefully that was a helpful little review of the AD shifters. Let's get into a real-world example of demand shocks to see how these things actually work. So the Great Depression. First of all, let's start with a full model at long-run equilibrium. Now, first of all, I apologize. I will not be able to label all the parts of this model clearly. There's not enough room for me to write with this marker, so sorry about that. I'll try to do it color coordinated to keep everything straight. So we're starting, everything is perfectly lined up. Then we have a negative demand shock. Seeing negative demand shock, that tells you, first of all, which line is going to shift, AD, and which way will it shift. If it's a negative demand shock, it's going to shift to the left. Okay, so now our equilibrium is about here, where AD meets SRAS. This was caused by the stock market crashing and bank failure. So what category would those things be a part of? That's about wealth and income, because your assets in the stock market, as well as any savings accounts or assets that you have in the bank, now have deeply declined in value. Now, what happened in the Great Depression is that led to a second demand shock. Business and consumer confidence declined. So first, which category would that be? That's about expectations and confidence. And if businesses and consumers have seen the horrible things that happen to the stock market, and they realize that there's nothing that's keeping their money safe in the bank, clearly their confidence is going to go down. So which way will AD shift? It's going to shift even further to the left. So you can see how what would have just been a recession, that all of those things happening at once actually led to a much, much bigger gap. The difference between the current equilibrium and the long-run potential is really, really far. We're way to the left of where we should be. Ergo, depression. Now, I want us to see, so we are here. We are at this point where everything is super, super bad, and we want to get back to our potential. So you could do two things. We could have supply shift or demand shift to get there. So if you're at this point, let me make it yellow. Okay, so think about which way would supply shift? If supply shifted to the right, then you could intersect with short run. SRAS would move down, you're back on long run. That would be fine. But our government doesn't have a lot of control over short run aggregate supply. That's what businesses can do. So this note here at the bottom, the government can manipulate aggregate demand much easier than it can manipulate short-run aggregate supply. Because think about it, our government controls fiscal policy. It controls government spending and taxes and transfers. It can do a lot to fix aggregate demand. So, a surge in government spending during World War II created a positive demand shock. So now it's going to shift back to the right. I'm trying to make it really big to see how we were here, then we had this horrible depression, but then it goes back again. So the point of all this is, in real life, we had a demand shock, a negative demand shock that caused this horrible depression, and then a positive demand shock that got us out of it. Now, if we're doing government spending, which AD shifter would that be? You can call that GDP, or you could call that fiscal policy, because government spending is included in either one of those two things. So I know that was a very messy diagram, but I want us to see that there are real-world demand shocks that do affect our economy. And this idea at the bottom that if we are in a recession or a depression, the government has an easier job intervening with aggregate demand than it does short-run aggregate supply. We'll talk about that more later. But if you're in a gap, it's much easier for governments to do stimulus packages and things that affect AD. It's harder to twist the arms of business and have a real noticeable effect on SRAS. In this image of a negative demand shock, I did go ahead and add the long-run supply curve just to see how it works the same way with it. Here we can tell that you definitely have a negative demand shock, and even if we didn't have this nifty label at the top, we should be able to tell because you can tell that aggregate demand shifted left. That's all a negative demand shock is. In this picture, we were at E1 and then E2. So from E1 to E2, the price level falls and the level of aggregate output or real GDP falls. If you recall back with demand, whatever demand does, price and output do the same. So on the aggregate demand level, the aggregate price level, and the aggregate output or real GDP all fall. Falling prices and falling real GDP or output equal a recession. So it might sound bad if our GDP is down, and that is definitely a bad thing. Universally, people agree you don't want your real GDP to be getting smaller. But sometimes people think that falling price levels are good. And that's not true. When price levels are down, deflation tends to lead to high unemployment, which we do see in a recession. So we do want to be aware of the fact that high prices aren't always bad and low prices aren't always good. In this image, we have a positive demand shock. And even without the title yet again, we know that because aggregate demand went to the right, which is the definition of a positive demand shock. From that shift from E1 to E2, what happened to the aggregate price level in the short run? Well, it increased because we can see in the model that that's what's happening here. In the short run, real GDP is also going to the right, which is an increase. So demand shocks are going to cause aggregate output, or real GDP, and aggregate price level to move in the same direction. So a positive demand shock would lead to an increase in all of those. A negative demand shock would lead to a decrease in all of those. Let's go ahead and practice drawing this aggregate model with all of the lines and all of the subpoints. So you want to start by setting everything up. There are some information there in your notes about the things that you need, but we know what goes on the axes. We know we have the three lines, LRAS, SRAS, and AD, and where they all go. And as a rule of thumb, always start with all three intersecting unless you're told otherwise. We'll learn later what that looks like, but as a default, start with them all lining up. And then we'll read the question. So you're going to set it all up, label the axes, put all three lines, have them intersect, do the subpoints. Then let's pause, let's read this question. It says, suppose that consumers and firms become pessimistic about future income and future earnings. Does that sound like something that will shift AD, SRAS, or LRAS? That's going to shift AD. We know we have that hint of aggregate demand or demand shock, but this will certainly not always be the case. So this is what your drawing should look like. We have the things that we should have default. Everything I'm underlining in blue is something that you could have done. There's E1. YP and YE. Now remember, YP stands for the long run potential. That always goes to the bottom of long run. The fact that we had all of them intersecting and that this is our first equilibrium means that YE is at the same point. And you want to draw it underneath YP because they're not next to each other. They are on the same vertical plane. And then you'll trace the first equilibrium over to where it hits the price axis, and we have PE. So everything that I underlined in blue was the default stuff that we can do before we even read the question. Now we're seeing that demand, that aggregate demand is affected, and pessimism is going to be a left shift. And then we can add AD2, E2, YE2 for our new equilibrium output, and PE2 for our new equilibrium price. I added the arrow between AD and AD2. You're going to have the price change decrease and the output change decrease. Now that you've done one of these aggregate model setups, you should feel more comfortable doing this one. So we're going to again start on long run. Go ahead and draw everything as we know it's starting with all the lines intersecting. So you can pause and set up everything you need. Then we read the category, the shifter. It says, suppose that a healthy stock market has increased consumer wealth. So think of what line that will shift and in which direction, and then go ahead and draw that. Label the subpoint, and now let's check. So we had E1 starting on the long run, our YP, our YE, our PE, and all those other points. And then a healthy stock market would shift aggregate demand to the right. It's going to make the price level increase, and it's going to make the output increase. These arrows that I'm drawing, by the way, are required parts of your model. So we want to not only have the YE and the YE2, but an arrow. The PE and the PE2 and an arrow. That's technically covering your bases and being a little bit redundant, but it's very helpful on the AP exam in case something doesn't photocopy well or it's unclear to see what it is that you've drawn. Because here, there's no doubt about what you're trying to demonstrate. So I always teach you to do both a 2 for the next point and an arrow. Now that we're getting a little bit more comfortable with these shocks, we'll talk about supply shocks. A supply shock always refers to SRAS. So something that's going to affect the short-run aggregate supply in the economy. In these pictures, I did add the long-run curve, but you can tell the one on the left is a negative supply shock because SRAS is shifting left or inward. And the one on the right is a positive supply shock because SRAS is shifting right or outward. Now to review, we have 3 SRAS shifters. Commodity prices, major inputs economy-wide that if the price of them changes, it will affect many, hundreds if not thousands of households and firms. Second shifter is nominal wages. Anything that affects the price of labor is part of production costs, and that cuts into profit, which affects short-run supply. And the third one is about productivity. Can your workers produce more in the short run? Then SRAS would shift to the right. A negative supply shock is anything that would shift SRAS to the left. So if production costs are up, and this could be in the form of commodities or nominal wages, SRAS would shift to the left. Or there's just a reduced quantity producers are willing to supply. So it could be about their ability to supply, productivity, or their willingness. Maybe they don't think that the price is something that they want to produce those goods and services at that price. Any of those things that make SRAS shift left or inward creates a negative supply shock. A severe commodity shortage would be a good real-world example of this. like the major oil shortages that we had in the 1970s. They're going to create big increases in the aggregate price level because they shift SRAS left. Positive supply shock would be SRAS shifting right or outward. So we could have production costs lowered. Commodities are now cheaper. Nominal wages are now cheaper. And anything that increases profit is going to increase the quantity producers are willing to supply at any price. If we had a major increase in technology, that's going to be a huge positive supply shock. So when all of a sudden computers are brought into the workplace and then the internet is brought in, it's going to lead to productivity surges because all of a sudden you can take orders online. You don't have to pay people to answer the phones and things like that. That's going to make a major effect to SRAS shifting to the right. Here we have a model showing a negative supply shock because SRAS is shifting to the left. Now, there's a brand new term that is caused by a negative supply shock, and that's called stagflation. Stagflation is a combination of two words. So we have stagnation and inflation. Inflation is clearly referring to the price level. So we can see that from E to E2, the price level went up, inflation. But the overall output level went down. So that means that the economy is stagnant. Our output is stagnant. This term, stagflation, is the worst thing. It is horrible. Before, think about it with demand shocks. You would have one problem, but not two. So, okay, we have inflation, but at least output's high and we're making a lot of stuff. Or, output's low, but prices are low too, so that means that, people are able to afford things. There wasn't this horrible economy-wide problem. Stagflation, both are bad. Inflation is bad, and a decrease in productivity, a decrease in real GDP is bad. So this is the worst case scenario where there's no, oh, well, it's good for this group, but it's bad for this group. No, stagflation is bad for everyone. We want to avoid this. So stagflation is only caused by negative supply shocks, and it leads to a stagnant economy. Our growth, our output is not going up, it's going down. And inflation. There's less stuff and it costs more. In the negative supply shock, prices went up and output went down. In the positive supply shock, we can see that our prices are going down and our real GDP is going up. So for supply shocks, we have one thing happening to the price level and something else happening to the aggregate output or the real GDP. If you are trying to figure out, well, which is going up and which is going down, whatever's happening to supply is also happening to the quantity. So here, supply SRAS went to the right. So if we are supplying more, then our quantity is higher. Real GDP is going to go up. But more stuff means it's less valuable. So when you make more, the prices fall. On the reverse, the negative supply shock, if we're making less stuff, it shifted left, then your quantity should decrease. But if you have fewer goods, the rarity, the scarcity of those goods makes the prices go up. So it'll definitely be in a negative and opposite direction between price level and real GDP. But the real GDP is going to move the same way as the SRAS curve shifted. Now you are an expert at drawing and labeling these models with subpoints. We have two more examples. Yet again, go ahead and set up the models with them beginning at E1 that's on the long run potential. Then in this scenario, suppose that commodity prices, oil for example, rapidly increase. So think about which line will shift. Go ahead and draw that shift, the subpoints, and your arrows. Pause for a moment, then check your answer. So here we have, if commodity prices increase, that's going to make SRAS shift to the left. So would that be a positive or a negative supply shock? That's a negative supply shock. So we have supply shifting left, the price level is increasing, and the amount of real GDP is decreasing. Next example, set up your model at long run, and then draw and label the shift. Pause to check your answer. Suppose that labor productivity were to increase with better technology. So we have a positive supply shock, like so. Now, some of you might have looked at this and said, wait, productivity is the one thing that can potentially shift SRAS and LRAS. True. So the question is, do we think that this is a short run only, or could it also maybe be long run? This one's kind of a gray area. Better technology, in many cases, is going to make that labor force more productive in a few years, too. So if you wanted to do it like that, that would be just fine. You would just add an LRAS2, showing that not only are you more productive in the short run, but you're also going to be more productive in the long run. And wherever LRAS goes, YP goes as well. So we're going to have a YP2, showing that our potential output has also increased. The rest of it's fine. The equilibrium 2 is in the right place, the PE2 is in the right place, the YE2. So if you wanted to add that long run shift, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't add a lot. It doesn't change a lot. All you have to do is add the second long run supply curve and a YP2, and you're good to go. We have learned in these notes that we are always on the short run. So if all three lines are not going to perfectly line up, then you know that equilibrium is absolutely always on SRAS. We've also learned that in the long run, all prices are flexible. Remember, your sales price might go up, but in the long run, eventually, nominal wages are going to go up too, which cuts into the profit. So in the long run, we're going to be returning to this flexible price point and our potential. You can see that in this model here, our ELR is just saying that equilibrium happens to be at our long run, where our potential output, our YP, is the same as our YE. So even though it is not labeled in this picture here, it is not an optional part. You need both. YP is saying where our potential is. YE is saying where we actually are. Having both at the same vertical plane really just says that both of them are on the same spot, but both of them are a necessary part of labeling a model. We have now seen what long-run potential looks like, and we're about to start learning about two new but very important parts of this model, the gaps. When equilibrium is not lining up with a long-run supply curve, we're in a gap. If it lines up to the left, like it does in this picture, we have a recessionary gap. So go ahead and draw this model and label everything in the box before you turn the page and start filling in the notes. So we can see here that we have our long-run supply, which intersects with our potential output. Those things line up together. Now where SRAS and AD meet is equilibrium, and that gives us our equilibrium output. The fact that equilibrium is to the left of our potential tells us it's less than our potential. So we are not going to label YE down here below YP. No, don't do that because it's not there. It's to the left of it. And there's no arrow because nothing shifted. That's just where it is. So if you imagine that this is a graph, this YE lines up with E, just like the PE lines up with it. So that's where it belongs. So when you're labeling this model, it is possible to start drawing it at the recessionary gap. Like I said, no E2, no arrows. This is where everything is beginning. Okay, so now I'm going to go through and talk about the notes. We can see here that this recessionary gap could have been caused by a decrease in aggregate demand. Maybe it was on the long run and then it shifted, it decreased, and now all of a sudden we're here, we're in a gap. Either way, we know that our current output is to the left of, it's less than our potential output. And that gives us a recessionary gap. We know that in a recession, unemployment is high. Unemployment is high because workers are not producing the output that is needed. Maybe they're not being very productive or being very efficient, or maybe demand is down and that's just led to high unemployment. But either way, in a recession, we have high unemployment. When unemployment is high, think back, that means that a ton of people are looking for work, and so you can pay somebody less, which is going to make nominal wages fall. That shifts SRAS. So the gap itself created the problem with high unemployment. High unemployment changes nominal wages. If nominal wages are down, what will happen to SRAS? It will shift to the right. So we're going to have SRAS2 with an arrow. We have E2. We have, you could either label this PE2 or P2. And we have YE2. Because remember, YE is talking about our equilibrium output. Did our YP shift? No. YP only shifts when long run shifts, and long run didn't move. Our new equilibrium point is on the long run, right? Our E, our original equilibrium, is a short run equilibrium because it's not on the long run curve. But our E2 is a long run equilibrium because it's back meeting our potential. So in the long run, what is the effect on the aggregate price level? Look at your model, we can see that price level fell. So to delete all this, SRAS shifted to the right and APL fell. So that's how you get out of that recessionary gap naturally. Nobody intervened. Nobody made any of this happen. They happened naturally. That the recession itself leads to high unemployment. High unemployment makes nominal wages fall. Nominal wages shift SRAS. That returns us back to the long run potential. And now we're going to talk about the other gap, the inflationary gap. So first, please turn back to the page before where you're drawing these things and go ahead and draw the proper inflationary gap. So we have APL, we have real GDP, we have our long run curve, which always lines up with YP. The new thing here is that SRAS and AD intersect to the right of our long run potential. So we have our equilibrium over here to the right. With that, that will line up and give us YE as well as PE. So these are all of the required points. Remember again, no arrows, nothing shifted. It is starting at this inflationary gap where our output is higher than our potential. Like most things, it sounds great that we're making more than our potential, but the fact that long run hasn't moved shows us that it's not sustainable. Wherever we are, we're only there temporarily, and there's going to be consequences that come with operating above our means. So, In this inflationary gap, we have low unemployment. Because think about it, if you're making a lot more than your potential, that means everybody's working and they're working really, really hard. With low unemployment, you have very few people looking for work because everybody has a job. So if you need a qualified employee, you're going to have to pay them more. So that's going to lead to an increase in nominal wages. So first, inflationary gap. That creates low unemployment. The low unemployment increases nominal wages. Nominal wages shift SRAS. If nominal wages increased, SRAS would shift to the left. And let's go ahead and draw and label that properly. SRAS2 with an arrow. E2 PE2. And I know that my PE didn't perfectly line up with my E on the original computerized model, but I can look at what I drew and see that my equilibrium price at E2 is higher, so I need to draw it higher on the axes. And then YE2 with an arrow showing that our output decreased. So, yet again, do I need a YP2? No, because YP2 only happens if LRAS shifted and LRAS didn't shift. Our original equilibrium, our E1, is a short-run equilibrium only. Our E2 is back at our long-run potential. So in this situation, again, this is showing how economies naturally self-correct. There's no fiscal policy. There's no government intervention. No one made any of these things happen. Unemployment naturally falls, which leads to a natural increase in nominal wages, which naturally affects short-run supply. No one intervened. So the point of both of this slide and the one before is to see, okay, we're in a gap. We know that the goal that the economy is always trying to return to the long run. This is showing how it happens without intervention. And then one more question here. In the long run, what is the effect on the APL? We can look at our picture and see that it went up. Now this is where things get interesting. We had an inflationary gap, and by solving it, it led to more inflation. Yes, it did. So what's interesting is that inflation is almost inevitable in this model here, in this situation. But at least we've returned back to our potential, and our unemployment numbers are going to be more in line with the natural rate of unemployment once we come back to that potential. Now that we know a little bit about how these models work, I wanted to make sure that you're understanding labeling, where equilibriums would go, and the like. So looking at this picture, we don't have any equilibriums listed. We have an LRAS, SRAS, SRAS1, which is okay because we can tell that there's an arrow, which is telling us that SRAS came first, and that SRAS1 is the second one, and then AD and AD1. So first of all, can you tell where the original equilibrium 1 would be? Look at it. If you feel confident, go ahead and draw it in your own notes. Okay, E1 is there because it's where the original supply line intersects with the original demand line. Now, from that, we actually don't know if a point to the left or a point to the right came next. If aggregate demand came next, the equilibrium would be to the left. If supply shifted first, it would be to the right. And either one of these things could have happened. But this thing tells us that the AD shift occurred first. So we're at E1. Where is E2 going to be? right here. So it's the same supply line, nothing happened to supply, but it's a new aggregate demand. So we have a few questions here so far. I don't want to get too far. Is E1 short run or long run? E1 is long run, and how do you know? Because it's on the long run supply curve. E2, which one would it be? It is short run because it is not on LRAS. It's only on the short run supply. So E2 is a short run equilibrium point. Now, hopefully you can tell that E2 creates a gap because we're off the long run potential. Now, is it a recessionary gap or an inflationary gap? It's to the left of our potential, therefore it is a recessionary gap. Okay, now let's talk through, review the explain, the multi-step question. In a recession, is unemployment going to be high or low? It's going to be high because our output is down. And when unemployment is high, a lot of people are looking for work. So as a hiring manager, you could hire people for less money. Nominal wages will start to fall. When nominal wages fall, what does that shift? SRAS. And if nominal wages fall, SRAS shifts to the right. And that is what happened. So it's where our new supply curve meets our new demand. Once we had shifted from E1 to E2, then the AD, this line, pretty much disappears. We are off that line. It is dead to us. So it's the new demand meets the new supply. And then E3, is that short run or long run? It is long run because we're back on our potential. Whenever the economy is not currently on the long run equilibrium, there's a gap, and those gaps can either be recessionary or inflationary. Hopefully, at this point, you can look at a visual of one of the models and tell if it's recessionary or inflationary. If it's intersecting to the left of our long run potential, recessionary gap. If it's intersecting to the right, that's an inflationary gap. Now, this output gap equation will do two things. One, if you don't have a model, it will show you mathematically which gap we're in. If the answer is a negative number, we're making less than our potential, then the actual minus potential divided by potential, it's going to give you a negative number. So a recessionary gap would have a negative number for an output gap. If we're making more than our potential, actual minus potential divided by potential will give us a positive number. So the answer will tell us recessionary or inflationary. And the size of the gap. How far are we away from our potential? And this matters. If we're trying to decide whether or not we should intervene in the economy, we want to know how bad the gap is. We also will use this to determine, are we in a recession or a depression? Because remember, there's kind of a gray area between the two. A depression is just a really long and deep recession. So if this number of the gap is getting bigger, 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 we might start getting worried that we're headed towards a depression. Also, if you think back to earlier this unit and the multiplier, remember government spending can multiply. So we need to know how big is the recession to know how much money do we need to spend to have it multiply and fix the gap. So this equation is very useful, not just in our kind of theoretical macro land, but in truly fixing the economy by realizing how much spending do we need to put in, how many dollars of tax cuts do we need to change to end up solving our gap and not just creating a problem on the opposite side. Here we have a bit of a summary of the gaps and how we get out of them. So if we are in a recessionary gap, the output gap is negative because we're making less than our potential. In a recession, remember, our unemployment is going to be high, so nominal wages will fall. When nominal wages fall, SRAS will increase. This moves us back to potential, and then our output gap is zero. When you get out of the gap, when the recession or the inflation is stopped, the output gap disappears. In an inflationary gap, the gap would be positive, more than our potential. Unemployment would be low. And because of that, there's very few qualified workers. If you need somebody desperately, you're going to pay them more. Nominal wages will rise. When wages rise, SRAS will shift to the left. This is going to bring us back to our potential and make our gap now zero. The moral of the story is that in the long run, the economy self-corrects. Yes, we have recessions and inflations, we have gaps, but they fix themselves. Those changes in nominal wages and unemployment and SRAS happened without any involvement, with any intervention. So if our recessions and inflations aren't that bad, if the gaps aren't extreme, then we can wait and let the business cycle take care of itself. You know that these things naturally are going to go up and go down. If we feel like the recession or the inflation are really bad, or they're really long and it's taking too long for them to correct themselves, if we don't want to wait years to get out of this. And sometimes if you think about it politically, maybe there's an election coming up and you want to show the voters, look, that the economy is improving. So sometimes we want to fast forward this process. We don't want to wait for it to self-correct. And in those cases, remember, what can the government control the easiest? Which line can they manipulate? Aggregate demand. Because fiscal policy, the one thing the government has direct control over, shifts AD. So if we let it fix itself, SRAS moves because of wages. If we intervene, AD tends to be the one that's moving.